Hello, my name is Elliot, and in this video, I'll be going over the Lineweaver-Burk plot. I'll start by talking a little bit about enzymes, talk about the Michaelis-Menten plot, and then get into how Lineweaver and Burk manipulated this plot to create their own plot that worked better for the analysis of enzyme kinetic data. Enzymes take a reaction path that already exists and they make it happen more often by providing an alternative mechanism with a lower activation energy. You can think about this like the reactant having to provide an energy investment to become a product. An example of an enzyme you may be familiar with is amylase. Amylase converts long sugar molecules like starch into shorter ones like glucose. That is why when you leave a starchy food like a cracker in your mouth for too long, it starts to taste sweet. However, before the glucose can be released as a product, the starch has to interact with the enzyme and go through a transition state. Reaction rates that use enzymes can change though. Here, if we treat the enzymes like robot workers, we can see that the amount of work that gets done depends on the enzyme concentration. For example, if there was a low enzyme concentration, you could treat that like there's not much work getting done, which would lead to less product conversion. Additionally, the substrate concentration also matters for reaction rate. Here, when there's a low substrate concentration, the enzymes are going to have a hard time finding and binding substrates such as starch in this case, meaning that less product would be formed in a given time. On the other hand, when there's a super high substrate concentration, the enzymes can be known as saturated. That is because the substrate concentration is so high in their environment that the enzymes have no problem at all finding and binding to new substrates. So as soon as glucose molecules are released, new substrates like starch can come in and fill those active sites, so the enzymes are always working, meaning that the product formation rate is going to be near its maximum. Now let's talk about the Michaelis-Menten plot. Michaelis and Menten noticed this relationship between substrate concentration and reaction rate, came up with this plot, and made this corresponding equation. This graph was revolutionary because it allowed the determination of the maximum reaction rate, or velocity max, and Km, which is the Michaelis-Menten constant. From this graph, Vmax is extrapolated from when the reaction rate reaches a high enough substrate concentration where it seems to level off about here, but reaction rate does increase to infinity substrate concentration, meaning that any experimentally determined Vmax before infinity substrate concentration would only be an estimation and not the accurate value. Because of the error in finding Vmax, Hans Lineweaver and Dean Burk sought out to find a new equation that could solve this problem with a more definite answer for Km and Vmax. Here's how they found the new equation. They took the Michaelis-Menten equation, took the reciprocal of both sides, separated the right term, canceled the s, and arrived at this final equation. Notice how this equation looks very similar to that of a line with y equals mx plus b. If we follow that logic and plot these points, we can see that y is going to be 1 over v, x is 1 over s, while the slope is km over vmax, with the y-intercept being 1 over vmax. Now, the intercepts for this graph are pretty important, so let's see how we can find them. If we take the Lineweaver-Burk equation, find the y-intercept when x is equal to 0, we can see that it condenses down to 1 over vmax, while the x-intercept when y is equal to 0 simplifies to negative 1 over km. Now let's move this information to the actual plot. Using the intercepts we found, you can see that it would be very easy to find the important values of km and vmax with these equations. Unfortunately though, the Lineweaver-Burk plot does have its limitations, as most of the points plotted on this graph are going to be at a relatively low substrate concentration, or high 1 over s. The x and y intercepts can only be determined by extrapolation, meaning that they're going to be heavily reliant on these points that are further away, making them prone to errors. Having said that, the Lineweaver-Burk plot is still a great model to use because using straight lines makes viewing enzymatic kinetic data much more simple. I'll highlight this point using this analogy. If we were to treat finding the enzymatic kinetic data like finding the perimeter of an object, the Michaelis-Menten plot would be an oval. Finding the perimeter of this object using only straight lines would become very difficult to do so accurately. On the other hand though, with the Lineweaver-Burk plot, it would be more like a rectangle. Using straight lines to find the perimeter of this object would be very simple to do so accurately. A practical application of this plot can be seen in the industrial production of high fructose corn syrup. This process uses the enzyme glucose isomerase to convert glucose into fructose, both of which being the main components of high fructose corn syrup. Now, companies would want to use this plot to monitor their enzyme efficiency so that they have maximum production rate while minimizing their waste. Now, the Lineweaver-Burk plot could help with this by providing information on the enzymatic kinetic data so companies could alter their enzyme conditions. That was my video on the Lineweaver-Burk plot. Here are my references. I hope you learned something and have a good day.